be ADA. They'd have to have a trash can and a recycling receptacle per truck, and they can't remain there overnight. They can't keep tables and chairs and their trash receptacles out there overnight.
I think it's I don't know. We have a couple of
There are some food trucks out there now.
I mean, they don't, they stay there, they don't work somewhere else. This is what they're saying is they would have to only be there during the day and then they can stay overnight.
5 days.
Right.
And right, that could definitely be
You're right,
an
you
option too.
could.
Well, the one that I see in the table, they move, right?
I don't know, they're always there when I drive by, but they're my, I've only been here since October and it's been cold most of the time, so.
The only time they move is during special events and then but otherwise. I think that we should allow them in parking lots, but they have some standards. I think they are popular.
I think some standards are good, yeah.
So maybe you take a closer look at these, you can give us your thoughts and more detailed comments. Definitely.
You should go back and get.
Sure, you can have this short, like a at the table.
Get out of the way.
Thank you guys for treating fairly.
They said yes, but I was.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Just sit wherever you like. So. Thank you.
Yes, it is. No, it's a small business, large business, workforce page. You know what, there's three nominees for each. Tell you all nine.
You have to go around. I mean, we haven't.
No,
we have
they do
everybody
that tonight. They actually will. They will.
Everybody's invited.
Ken Spiker actually brings up a briefcase.
Whether or not we'll all be
And
here.
he
I don't
opens
know.
it, and then they.
Well, represented today in the
Yes.
earlier session.
Gene wanted, that was really neat.
No signs of your craft.
Oh, yeah,
Create like a little drop back or recess.
yeah, and that's gonna make that piece.
Can't make it.
Basically, you know, One story.
Sure.
It was for you.
Well, the chamber. That was kind of very scaled down.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Sarah usually does a good job.
Yeah. She does.
We're gonna have to see each other.
I know, my husband's been out.
Oh, I don't want to sit here and be on TV.
Oh, yeah, we gotta have that.
Oh, no.
I see that.
We go over there every year. For all, we missed one this year. My daughter had a,
It's the first one they've been to in a while.
they changed the fish this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, they found out the week before the first one that Cisco's where they've been getting it, I think. They wouldn't get it to them until
Yeah.
like the end of March.
That's you're on that work, right?
Right.
And it's here, yes. Here we go. Yeah. You can.
You.
That's what I was.
You're vertical.
Yeah.
I'm looking at that work. Is that awful work? Okay, all right.
Right, you have to look at that, yeah, ever do that?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Yeah, 9 minutes. Yeah, it was good. Good, yeah. I want to wait for Jennifer and then we'll get started. Oh, you're there. Okay. All right, well, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. The time is 4:01. This is a joint city council planning commission meeting to discuss our comprehensive plan. The Open Meeting Act is posted on the rear wall next to the agendas. This time we'll do roll call for the city council.
Gibson?
Yes.
Ellis?
Yep.
Vaughn? Anna? Berger?
Yes.
Jensen?
Yes.
Sukram?
Yes.
Lightban? 5 council members are present, Mayor.
Do the planning commission next.
I'll wait for Jenna. I don't have all of their names, so if you want to call yourselves off, then I will write down who's present.
Sally's here.
Okay.
Okay, planning commission for ice.
Here.
Forsyth,
Here.
Lincoln,
Here.
Nielsen.
Yep.
And who do we have? Slayer, Carlson. Who else am I missing?
Rosanna.
Rosanna, yeah, Rosanna Yeager. We got 1, 2, 3, 5. 5 present. Forum.
Okay, item today is the draft downtown sub-area plan. So we'll hear from Nick and get that started.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for meeting us today. We appreciate you giving us time. A lot of content to go over today. We're first going to go over the draft downtown sub-area plan, and then I know Jackie has a presentation to go over for the UDC. But just to kind of bring you up to speed on what we've been working on over the last couple of months. and then also where we're going next. So we're going to go over a couple things. First, just the planning process, high level, just a review of what we've been doing and how this all ties together. We'll talk a little bit about the downtown sub-area plan, and then we'll go over next steps. So planning process, I know we've seen this slide quite a bit, but I just want to kind of reiterate how this all stitches together. Today, we're going to talk mainly about the comprehensive plan, but we are still working on the long-range transportation plan. I know HDR has been out here to give you a brief presentation. Next steps from them is delivering the actual long-range transportation plan report. So that's coming soon. In the meantime, our team is working on the comprehensive plan. So all those different chapters are going to make up the comprehensive plan, as well as this downtown sub-area. Jackie's going to go over the UDC, and we'll talk a little bit about how these two are going to work together. Where we're at in the comprehensive plan in the downtown sub-areas. So we have a 6-step process. We're at that community citywide framework plans. We're actually working on the chapters, developing recommendations for natural areas, transportation, community facilities, working through the introduction. We're going to stitch it all together in the implementation section. But as part of this, we've been working on this downtown sub-areas. We kind of fast-tracked this, got it closer to a draft version for this group to review. So that's what we want to talk about today. So just a brief overview again of the context of the downtown sub-area plan. So it does tie into the comprehensive plan. It does tie into the long-range transportation plan. There's feedback that we've received from both of those documents that have been folded into this sub-area. And then ultimately it'll inform some of the amendments or the zoning code changes that are going to need to happen in the UDC. So again, we're establishing the policy and the direction to make sure before we make any changes to the UDC that we all kind of agree this is the direction the downtown needs to be going. We did look at some of the past plans and studies that have been done here before, recognition that there's a historic district, the historic Main Street in downtown Fremont, as well as some of the work that's been done in the past. 2012, there was a downtown revitalization plan. That's also when you did your Fremont Blueprint for Tomorrow. As well as in 2021, there was an update to the Dodge County Housing Study. The reason those are important is there's some great recommendations in that 2012 plan. Some of that's been brought forward and updated, modernized to some of the best practices that we're seeing in the planning world, but also just things that we heard from the public, comments that we've tried to integrate into our plan recommendations the best we could. The housing study is going to inform quite a bit of the residential components that we're going to show today. Just why if anybody has a question about why we're trying to infuse more residential or density in the downtown, a lot of that is in response to there's a demand for it, there's a need for it, and there's some places where it's very appropriate. So we'll get into that in more detail. Comprehensive plan integration, I won't hit this too hard because we've talked about this a couple different times, but again, just historic character of the downtown is important. You don't want to lose that. You kind of want to build off of that. So when we're talking about the downtown, it's this area in here, that magenta. We want to identify residential uses or intensify residential uses in the downtown, but also surrounding the downtown. So those residential neighborhoods or districts that are around the downtown can support a lot of the uses, office space, employment, commercial, retail, restaurants that are in the downtown in a positive way. Just connecting some of these employment areas and the industrial areas to the south. We want to talk a little bit about the upper floor residential occupation. That was something that came up quite a bit, and those potential zoning amendments. Just a reminder, this is what was in our land use plan. This has also been pulled from the vision and the goals that we established. This was months ago, but this does inform some of the recommendations that we're preparing. So this is one of the goals in the overall comprehensive plan. We're going to revitalize or support revitalization efforts downtown to make it a vibrant, family-friendly center of activity in the community, providing new opportunities to shop, dine, and enjoy entertainment in the heart of the city. So again, just making the downtown a real focus. Okay, so this is mostly going to be new content. We talked about some of these as ideas in the past, but these are the actual recommendations. So as we go through this, if you have questions, please feel free to pause. Put a hand up. Let me know if you want to work through a specific comment. So the first thing, if you don't notice, we expanded the downtown study area quite a bit. So this black line is really the study area of the downtown. This red is that historic downtown district that exists now. I'm just showing that for context. So I think traditionally most people picture that historic downtown district as downtown Fremont, but it's a much bigger area. Feedback from the BID and feedback from this group when we met before was, John C. Fremont Park needs to be included in the downtown. And even though we're not providing specific recommendations about what to do in this space, how they're connected to downtown Main Street is important. So a lot of the plan's recommendations are going to show not necessarily how you would redevelop up in that area, but how you're connecting or pulling Main Street up into there, and then vice versa, how you bring people from John C. Fremont Park down into the downtown area. Conducted quite a bit of outreach for this project, both from the comprehensive plan perspective, received so much feedback about, what the challenges are in the downtown, what people think is missing or why they don't spend as much time downtown as they'd like to, why they go to other places. But also, heard a lot from people about why they like downtown, what they do down there, what restaurants they go to, why they shop downtown. They love the architecture. They love just being down there. It's a very different space compared to the rest of Fremont. We conducted a visioning workshop where we had maps out on the table. People were drawing out, where streetscapes could be, how parking might be a challenge, maybe where there's a parcel that could be redeveloped. So that feedback's been incorporated into this draft plan. So if at any point we feel like we're off track or it's not quite what someone meant, today's a great opportunity to help us make those changes before we move forward. One of the things that we'll talk about, so in the next section, are functional sub-areas. Downtown's a real big boundary area. We had shown that. And the best way that we have found to address some of the challenges as it relates to land use, parking, how buildings are sited, where people are moving into a space, we do it through these functional sub-areas. And as part of those functional sub-areas, we talk about these uses that are appropriate. So we're not going to identify specifically on a parcel, this should be light industrial, this should be commercial. Instead, we're going to identify a more flexible approach. So these functional sub-areas allow a mix of land uses. So any one of these land uses, if they're within that functional sub-area, would be appropriate. Now, I'll explain that a little bit more when we get to it. But uses that are appropriate in a downtown, residential, retail, office, service, restaurants and bars, entertainment and culture, artisan manufacturing, light industrial, institutional and civic, parks and open space. These mix of uses are appropriate throughout downtown. Some are more appropriate in other functional sub-areas. I'll talk about that in a second. And then downtown mixed use. When we say mixed use, those are buildings that are, on the ground floor, restaurant, retail, commercial or service. Upper floors could be residential, could be office space, could be flex space, maybe uses that we're not quite thinking about what it could be. We want to leave the window open for that. The way we're going to identify on the functional land use plan, I think will make it a little bit more clear what we're trying to accomplish. Some specific considerations as it's related to land use in the downtown, historic preservation. So this isn't a detailed historic preservation plan, but we do acknowledge that those documents exist. There is a historic district, a historic Main Street in downtown that we don't want to, in any way negatively impact. So the plan's recommendations are in line with what your requirements would be as it relates to those historic buildings of that historic district. And then upper story infill, of the many issues that we heard about downtown, upper story infill and how to get more uses in these upper floors was a real issue. We're going to talk about it from a land use perspective. Down the line, Jackie's going to address it as much as the UDC, as much as the zoning code can. But our recommendations are also as part of your building codes, those need to be reevaluated. So there's only so much we can talk about at a policy level in this document. But down the line, if you want to see the types of uses that we're talking about here, the city's going to need to reevaluate its building codes and explore other options. Otherwise, those challenges are just going to be in place until that's addressed. Okay. So the functional sub-areas. So as an example, in what we've identified as this Broad Street functional sub-area, there's a variety of uses that could be appropriate. Services, office, retail, restaurants and bars, entertainment and culture, institutional and civic. So instead of specifically saying on this parcel, it needs to be this, in general in this area, those are the mix of uses that are appropriate. And each one of these functional sub-areas allow for or encourage different types of uses. So in the downtown, we wouldn't, or in the Main Street, historic Main Street functional sub-area, which is this one in red, we want to make sure that we're not focused on auto-centric type of uses. That's not the right built form. We don't want to see drive-throughs. We don't want to see buildings set back away from the sidewalk. Where maybe up on Military, that might be more appropriate. Buildings might have a space between them where parking occurs. And we'd like to see those buildings on Military closer to the sidewalk, but it's just a different building relationship with the road. So we acknowledge that. That's why we break the downtown into these functional sub-areas. I think the other ones that kind of stand out, so I talked a little about Military. Building heights there could be 1, 2, 3, 4 stories. That's appropriate. We'd like to see taller buildings. We'd like to see a better integration of mixed use along Military, especially on the south side as you start to transition into the downtown. But on the north side of Military, it might be a more commercial, it might be a more suburban style. And that's okay, as long as we're making those connections to the downtown and we're not changing the way people experience that transition into, Main Street. D Street, so that's this area in brown. We see a real opportunity for over time as this area experiences redevelopment or as opportunities arise. Might be an opportunity for more residential in this area. Could be single family attached, so townhomes, could be multifamily, 3-4 story buildings. Over time, we see an opportunity, these yellow areas is sort of an expansion on what that historic Main Street look and feel and uses and building style might be. They won't be historic because they'd be new buildings, but it could mimic it. It doesn't have to be a 1-for-1. We're not asking people to 100% copy the style of, a building built in 1920, but just pull some of those design elements, mixed use. So ground floor could be these different uses. Upper floor could be residential or office. What we're trying to do, especially at Military and here at Broad, is get what works really well here on Main Street and pull it over to Broad Street, pull it up to Military. That way, someone who's coming in from Broad Street or Military can see the downtown. There's a connection to the downtown through its architecture, through how the street wall looks, those types of things. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of move through this presentation. Before I jump ahead or keep going into some of the other sections, are there any questions about the functional sub areas, how land use is incorporated into that? Any thoughts or suggestions? Okay. Another thing I want to talk about are these catalyst sites. So these brighter yellow areas, and in any one of these areas, also these kind of these darker blue lines. The darker blue lines are redevelopment opportunities, and I want to make it clear that at any point, any parcel could redevelop. A property owner could decide that they want to do something very different, and that's okay. We identified some sites that we thought, based on our assessment and the types of uses that functional sub-area is talking about, these are real good opportunity sites, and we'd like to just put those out there and discuss them. So if a property owner came up, it's like, oh, well, this is perfect. The functional sub-area, we identified a use like this or this. These catalyst sites, opportunity sites as well, but we know that if this area were to redevelop, it could really spur a different kind of development pattern around it. So we're just looking at some examples of visualizations that support what the functional sub area is providing recommendations for. What we think down the line as maybe improvements happen on Military would be a very attractive redevelopment opportunity. So I'll show some examples of this as I go through. But by no means does this mean this is happening tomorrow. We're not building these tomorrow. A lot more work would need to be done before that's even possible. And I know we talked with the BID and the steering committee earlier today, and some of the concerns they had were like property owners may want to be in this building for the next 30 years. And that's perfectly fine. What we're trying to do with this downtown sub-area plan is, in case somebody does want to redevelop or in case somebody wants to do something different, we just want to make sure it's in alignment with this plan's policies, with this plan's recommendations. So as I go through this, if you have questions, we can talk about that. So this first concept, the strip mall redevelopment. So here's Broad Street, here's Park Avenue. We're actually fronting this redevelopment. There's a strip mall along 6th. And again, just as an opportunity, if that strip mall was ever able to be redeveloped, we want to flip that orientation. We want that building closer to the road. We want it closer to 6th Street. We want that for a couple of reasons. If you're coming off of Broad Street, that becomes a visual cue that there's a more traditional downtown. There's a more walkable area, something that's more centric to pedestrians being here, as opposed to right now, that's a very auto-centric site right here. You got the parking that's along the front of 6th Street, the building setback, it's a low building. So again, just flipping that orientation and increasing the height, it'll tie into the building. So if you're imagining yourself, you're going north on Broad, you take a right on 6th, you got that strip mall, and then right there is a series of mixed-use buildings, much taller once you get across Park. We're just trying to pull that over to Broad Street. So that's just one concept. We also talk about along Park Avenue, so north of 3rd, south of 4th, taking that public parking lot and potentially seeing it redeveloped. Could be the whole quarter of the block, could just be a portion of it getting redeveloped. I could see a portion of maybe along 4th Street that getting redeveloped, and the rest of this stays as a surface parking lot that serves both a public use, but also could serve some of the new residential or commercial uses that are in there. One of the concerns that came up from the BID was, we already feel like there's a parking challenge or a parking issue in the downtown. And I would say as part of this study, we've not done a detailed parking analysis. That's something that should come out of our recommendations, and we've identified that as something you should explore. But I do think it's very important, and I have seen this when we do this in other downtown plans. When you do a parking study, which is something you'll want to do after this and before you go into like a detailed plan, when you do a parking study, it's an assessment and an inventory of your existing parking. It's a capacity analysis, but you also want to have a land use plan, or as we have, this functional subareas that talks about where you're going. It forecasts future uses. So that way, when you do that parking study, it's an assessment of what your current challenges are, but it also takes into consideration how redevelopment might impact that parking. So that's why we're planning for what the land uses could be. Your parking study needs to take in both existing conditions and what your forecast for your land use. Another example of two catalyst sites. So this is along D Street. So if you're at D Street on the east side of the road, 3rd Street to the south, 4th Street to the north. This just shows right now there's a series of uses. They're setback, auto service. This would require some parcel consolidation along D Street, but something that's more like multifamily. So it could be, a residential component. It could be a multifamily building. It could be single family attached, but we're just trying to get a more intense residential use, or denser residential use closer to the downtown. This would be 100% residential. There probably wouldn't be a commercial or service component at the ground floor. And again, it's just the more people we can get living in the downtown or adjacent to the downtown, that's more people that are activating downtown during the day, during nights. So you're seeing more people going to the restaurants, more people using those services or those retail options. And then as a fourth option is this military Main 8th and D Street. So on this block, we're north of Military Avenue. We're between Main Street and D Street and 8th to the north. And it's taking what is right now the old Bing site, single story buildings that are pushed way back. There's parking in the front or just these vacant lots up in the front. We're trying to pull that commercial closer to the Military Avenue, get that component for pedestrians that are maybe walking down Military. They could walk right into these commercial sites. There'd still be some parking along Military, but this isn't all a big parking lot. We just want a little bit. This is how people would come in. Primarily parking would be to the rear. And then there might be an alley, and then to the north, so along 8th Street, fronting 8th Street, would be single family attached, so more townhomes or condo types of units. So any questions about these catalyst sites? Okay. So urban design, the way people experience a downtown, architecture and buildings and that build form is critical. There's also this urban design concept too. How do you get to these spaces? Where are the monuments? Where are the gateways? How do you identify that you're entering into a downtown? We're pretty excited about some of these ideas where we're saying, along Military, there should be some gateway opportunities. But even to take that a step further and do these archways at Main Street and Military Avenue. So you're coming from the east and you see these archways. So you're going to turn in and go down Main Street, or coming from the west and you see these archways. Same thing coming down Broad Street. You'll see right there at 6th, this archway, and it's going to draw people in. They're going to know that there's something significant either to the east or to the south. And we're just trying to denote something that's special. So this is your downtown district. This is your Main Street. So that's in addition to what could be these more traditional gateways. I would say directional signage is something that's very important. We show directional signage here. We also talk about, even kind of stepping back, making sure that people that are coming up Bell or out on 23rd, are south of the tracks on Broad Street, know that downtown is this way. So you want to make sure you have these big prominent signs. We talked a lot about what that could look like, provide some examples. You want to push people or identify how to get to the downtown. And then once you get there, they need to know how to move around that space. So directional signs telling you where to park, where some of the key features in the downtown are. How do I get to John C. Fremont Park? That type of stuff. So those directional signage are very helpful for visitors that are coming to your town who maybe aren't as familiar.
And can I stop you next?
Yeah.
So the present downtown has one-way streets.
Correct.
Has there been any discussion to keep the one-way street that we have today or to change any of that, say to go in two different directions, say Main Street as we know?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Let me, we're gonna get to that in a couple of minutes. So you're teasing out the idea. That's good.
All right.
So this talks also about some parking lot screening. You know, maybe redevelopment's not possible on every site, and it's not. I mean, just in terms of capacity or timeline. So on some of these parking lots, these larger surface parking lots, we want to continue that street wall. When we say street wall, when you think of Main Street, you have this nice, consistent street wall. There's no breaks in it for the most part along Main Street. And at some point, those drop off in their surface parking lots, and it's a real drop off. So we want to see vegetation, canopy trees continuing that street wall. So we identify some locations here in green that just show if we're not going to see this redevelop, and that's not going to be possible everywhere, let's get some perimeter landscaping along these sidewalks, between the sidewalk and the parking lot. Identify some opportunities for murals. We want to encourage more murals. There's a process for that. But that's just something that can be very unique to a downtown, to a community. You know, you can talk about your history. You can just do something fun. It can be very artistic. And then same thing with public art and outdoor gathering spaces was something that we heard kind of throughout the process, just having more public art in the downtown. Built form, where we talk about built form, just an acknowledgement of what the heights are and really what's appropriate as you start to transition to the residential to the west, or as we start to transition to the residential to the east. You know, your taller buildings traditionally are going to be along Main Street, 3 to 5 stories, along D Street and along Park Avenue. You know, for the most part, you could see at least on what I'll say is the west side of D Street and the east side of Park, those can be 2 to 4 stories in height. You know, you're starting to transition up to what's going on in Main Street. But as you get to the west of Park and to the east of D, you do want to start seeing that step down occur. Again, just so you're not creating conflicts with the residential districts that are surrounding downtown. We talked a little bit about the street wall. Storefronts, same thing. You just want to make sure you have vibrant storefronts. And what we mean by that is their transparency is what's appropriate in downtown. I want to be able to look into a building and see that it's activated, that it's exciting. You know, it could be different types of services or restaurants. Even if you have an office space, you just want to make sure the floor plans are open, so you're not closing it off and it doesn't look like a vacant space. So those are the types of recommendations that we provided in this section. Streetscaping, pedestrian amenities, intersections and crosswalks, sidewalks. So these are those public realm improvements, both through hardscape, also through vegetation, that can really change the way a space feels when you're moving around, both as a driver, it kind of slows people down, but also as a pedestrian, it just feels more inviting when you have those pedestrian amenities there. You feel like you're supposed to be there. And then it was something that was accommodated, you know, a lot of different, a lot of different different treatments. So for site furnishing, benches, street lighting, this landscaped area, you can do planters, raised planters. You can do a lot of different open pit landscaping options. But again, just softening the space. You have a lot of streetscape, or I'm sorry, you have a lot of opportunities for streetscape in your hardscape downtown right now. You have great bump outs already in place. I think just getting more softscape, more vegetation in there can really help kind of improve the identity or the aesthetics in downtown. We talked about this, I already talked about this a little bit, but just the wayfinding and the gateways and the directional signage and developing a program, making sure that it's all interconnected is extremely important. And then just opportunities for murals and public art. And you could see, you know, you install public art throughout the downtown. A lot of downtowns that we're working in are doing art walks, or you know, they're connected to the local artisans in the community, and just giving opportunities for installations. Could be, you know, sculptures, could just be fun benches, could be different signage or paintings, whatever it might be. But just something that as you're moving through the downtown, there's these opportunities for just neat, I guess, experiences. You see stuff that's really unique to Fremont. And then I talked about the parking lot screening. There's a lot of different ways to go about that, but I would just say that that's something you can see with these surface parking lots. You can go as far as, you know, planting big parkway trees or canopy trees with shrubs, or it can be as simple as just some native landscaping, some grasses that have some type of interest or aesthetics. All right, transportation. So there's a couple things that we talked about in the transportation framework for the downtown sub-area. We talked about the one-way, two-way conversions. So we got a couple options for that and what that could look like. We talk about roadway configurations, and what we mean by that is along Broad Street and Military, some really interesting options that you could explore there. So we've provided some graphics and some visualizations. And then just connections into the neighborhood, how people who live in the west side of downtown or in the east side of downtown or even the north, how are they coming into downtown Main Street? One thing too, before we go too much further, is the truck routes. I think truck traffic in downtown is a significant challenge. There's a lot of trucks going to the downtown. There's even more trucks going through downtown on Broad Street and even along Military. So, with the bypass coming online, there's a lot of opportunities to see a different pattern for trucks in Fremont. Once that bypass is complete and that infrastructure is in place, I think establishing truck routes and how people should be moving through or around the downtown is important. And then the last piece of that is really enforcement. I mean, if it's getting abused or you're having real challenges, that's when enforcement becomes important. But I think there's sort of a wait and see what the bypass impacts are and how you can start to offset some of that truck route or that truck traffic in the downtown. Okay, so a couple things. The first one is along Broad Street, we're recommending more traffic calming solutions. So it's not a complete reconfiguration of Broad Street as a road. So the back of pavement to back of pavement would stay the same. Where we have those bump outs, what can you put into those bump outs that would just slow down traffic? So again, more vegetation and more visual cues that pedestrians are crossing Broad Street. Those traffic calming solutions can slow down traffic. I said earlier, I mean, you come down that Broad Street bridge and people are flying. I mean, they're moving really fast. And I think just whatever you can do to slow down that traffic just makes it feel safer to a pedestrian that, crossing Broad Street isn't this insurmountable pass that makes it too challenging. And then the other aspect is Military. And I know we talked about this before last time we were here, but in the long range transportation plan, working with HDR, they've done an assessment and had found that even if you were to remove a driving lane, so you got 2 lanes east, 2 lanes west, if you took that down in a road diet to 1 lane east, 1 lane west with left-hand turns up the middle, the traffic impact is negligible. So you're not seeing a huge impact on your overall traffic, but in terms of what that would do to that overall right-of-way, pretty significant. You could get a wider sidewalk, wider parkways, more vegetation. I think there's opportunities as you get closer to the downtown to install those gateways or those monument signs that we're talking about, or those arches. So a lot of exciting ideas can come out of just narrowing down that roadway. So that is an infrastructure change. You are changing back of pavement to back of pavement, but it really opens up how people are going to experience coming from Bell all the way down to your downtown. It opens it up to some pretty exciting opportunities.
Hey, Nick,
Yeah.
stop you on that Military item. Just curiosity, if we were to close third lane out there, or 1 lane, I guess what I'm trying to figure out here, because years ago, that's the street we actually had years ago. We increased this to 4 lanes.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, and I assume a traffic study has to take account. If they had in the past then too, to increase the range up there because of our traffic usage here. Because I do know there's certain times of the day that we do have that extra traffic out there, and then there's other times of the day you see very little.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, in that regard, if we actually stack more cars by having to lane east and west on that Military Street at certain times of the day. We've got this little bug out here on Military and Lutheran Road that people are unhappy about also in the intersection that they're stacking.
Yeah. So, yeah, one of the things too to keep in mind is when we talk about a road diet here, one of the main challenges with the current configuration is you have 4 lanes, not 5. In most instances, when you're looking at a commercial corridor that has 2 traffic lanes going the same direction, you would have a dedicated left, and you don't have that now. So a lot of the challenges that you experience are someone's in the left lane, they're going to make a left-hand turn, and you get a lot of stack up behind that. This configuration would allow a dedicated left-hand turn lane. So the 1 lane is still moving traffic, In extreme cases, sure. I mean, a car could be, enough cars could be stacking where it might impact that one travel lane. But based on the traffic numbers that we pulled for this and working with HDR on this, we just don't think that's going to be the challenge for this. And the opportunity, the upside to this is great. So, I mean, I can appreciate maybe the concern there, but I think having that dedicated left.
Right out here when you did this, we have a lot of accidents right out here in front of this building. People don't really have a good turn lane to go south or north here.
Yeah, and this would put a turn lane.
That problem here, I know that.
Yeah, so this would put a turn lane on the road, which is a dedicated turn lane is always safer. The other thing to keep in mind too is, in bringing the John C. Fremont Park into the downtown sub area, one of the reasons that was very beneficial was I think it sort of changed our focus on, yes, we need to be looking at downtown Main Street, but also how are people getting up there? So on Park and on Main Street are these pedestrian crossways, and trying to cross a road that has 2 traffic lanes can be challenging as a pedestrian. And having these, I mean, that's one less lane that you have to travel. Could be bump outs in place there as well. But having that one less traffic lane to cross really does decrease the amount of conflicts that you're going to see. And then having a dedicated left, a lot of times that can make it really challenging to get across a road when there's not a dedicated left. So the traffic isn't really mitigated in like a consistent way. So all of a sudden a car turns left and a bunch of traffic goes, and this would change that configuration. You have a consistent flow and a dedicated left. So it is beneficial. I do think it's something that's worth exploring. So we gave some options for that. And I would say moving forward, more questions could be maybe brought up when we talk with HDR and we're talking about the long range transportation plan. That's one of the studies that they're really interested in talking about with you. The pink, magenta, whatever I guess that color is, those are the one ways. And we recommend, we recommend exploring taking those to a two-way configuration. We've talked about that now a couple of times with the BID. We've talked about it with the steering committee. The upside to that would be you don't really have to change your infrastructure. There would be some costs. I mean, you would have to put up signage. You have to rotate some of the signs that you currently have. So I'm not saying that it's a free improvement, but in terms of having to reconfigure the road, that's not really the issue. And the reason why is because, imagine you're heading south on Main Street, that diagonal parking can still stay on the west side of the road. But now, instead of this being a southbound on the left-hand side, on this side, the northbound is going to start heading north now. It'll be a two-way conversion, but this parallel parking would stay. So you're not changing the pavement configuration, you're just changing the way cars are moving through it. We did look, you couldn't do angle parking on both sides, and that would be cost prohibitive, I would say at this point. And I think that was something that was determined in the previous study. I definitely would not recommend signalized intersections on Main Street. I know at one point that was a discussion and even what was in place, but these would be stop signs. So you would have to put in more signs. The flow would change a little bit, but from the perspective of someone coming from out of town, they tell you it makes it a lot easier to navigate in the downtown when these are two ways. It also opens up the opportunity to shutting down streets temporarily, like 4th Street or 5th Street between Park and Main Street. Makes it easier when one street gets shut down because you're not dedicated on one way. So you got to loop around the entire downtown. You just go to the next street because it's a two-way. So I think for a lot of reasons, exploring and ultimately, converting the downtown into a series of two-way streets just makes a lot of sense. And go ahead.
No, that's all right. I was just wondering, because some of the feedback I've gotten from some of the owners down there as well, when you have supplies to deliver, their little vans and stuff are parked in front. That's where they have their supplies delivered, and it blocks traffic then for that amount of time.
Yeah, and we talked about that.
That's one of the reasons.
That's one of the reasons.
To one ways.
Yeah, and I can think of, I think of all the downtowns you've been to. They figure it out, and I'm not saying it might not be as easy, but it is something that they can. There are solutions. The other thing is you have alleys, and the fact that you have alleys and you have the opportunity to utilize them is a unique feature to most downtowns. Not every downtown has an alley. We talked about a lot of communities have delivery hours. Some of them have dedicated truck routes where you can't even go on Main Street. So yes, I think right now it's probably the easiest it has ever been to make a delivery in downtown Fremont. And we're not trying to make it difficult for businesses, but we are trying to make it just as easy for a pedestrian or someone who's coming from out of town to move through that space. So again, that's that balance. So yeah, there's definitely a learning curve. One of the things that's kind of neat about your current configuration is, you cover some of the signs and you can do a pilot program. I mean, this is something you could do without doing the big transport or the big infrastructure changes. You could just do a pilot for a couple of weeks. It's going to be some frustration at the beginning. I'm not gonna lie, people are used to what they're used to. But over time, it's something that I think you'll see a benefit to. And it's not as cost prohibitive as some other communities would have to overcome, because that edge of payment isn't changing. So just something that we really think you should consider. And I think it'd be a great opportunity to make moving to the downtown a lot easier. The last section, and this was something we talked about with the BID, and I would love to get feedback from this group as well, is I think you've now seen this graphic from us a couple of times, and this is from the 2012 plan. And I would say of all the challenges that were brought up during the visioning workshop, this is one we spent some time on. And it is difficult for some businesses in the downtown to know who they're supposed to be talking to, who's in charge. They feel like they're a part of multiple organizations, or there's a couple different leaders in the downtown. Who is the ringleader? Who is managing all of these different organizations, but also all these different businesses and property owners? The BID plays a role. The city needs to play a role. Who needs to be in charge? And I think as we kind of go back and forth, communities handle this in very different ways. So we're looking for feedback from the group. If there's somebody that you think should be in charge of this, and should kind of wear the hat of come to us first, and we'll get you to the right person. If not, I think our initial recommendation would be that be something the city handle. But in terms of capacity or the ability to manage that, and when you have other organizations that are well equipped to do this, I think we should be having a bigger discussion about it. So I guess before I move to the next page, any thoughts on who should be sort of taking the reins in the downtown and managing these different organizations and these different efforts? All right. Go ahead.
That's a hard one to answer.
It is. And I can tell you, everybody we've talked to, it is a challenge to call it out. But I do think, again, this is, to me, systemic to probably a larger issue. Feedback we heard from the BID today was, we've heard these ideas before, and they're just not getting done. I mean, we're not 10 years ago, you had a very similar series of recommendations. We brought them up, I think, to like best practice, what some of the newer approaches are. But in terms of urban design, I mean, these are solid recommendations, and I think we're on the right track. But who's going to implement it? Who's responsible for seeing this through? It's where most communities tend to fall short. You have this great plan, but you don't know how to implement it. We're going to give you some of the recommendations on how to implement it, but who's taking it from there? And I think that's something that we don't have to figure out today, but I would love to hear some ideas about who we think should be taking that on.
Nick, has some of the other communities, has the city taken it on as a leadership role?
There is, but I mean, that's a position. That's not something that would be under the current staffing that you have. I mean, that is a whole different role. And, when you think about how important the downtown is, I think that's where, again, communities tend to fall short, because it's a big position to fill. It takes a lot of coordination and effort to do it. You have all of these players that are in place. So who's going to do that? And I would say in the short term, the BID is picking up some of this, but they're not doing all of it. So is that something you put to them? I mean, those are questions that I think we're looking for feedback on, to just get a temperature on what you think it should be.
That position wouldn't have to be limited to downtown either.
Doesn't have to be. I do think there needs to be a focus.
Citywide, but with focus on that.
You're right. Yep. And that's not uncommon too. Is you have people who are more focused on specific districts. So they might be looking at your commercial districts. They might be looking at your downtown, that type of thing.
So you got a Main Street Fremont organization that struggles to keep a half-time person. You've got the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and I think they recently lost their person. That those situations tell me that there's a need to have one consolidated position that deals with those issues, and coordinates it together. But where should that be? In Lincoln, the Lincoln Downtown Association is staffed And I don't know if they're fully paid for through BID fees or not. Our BID doesn't generate enough revenue for a position, but, you know, I don't know if they have other CDBG funding for it or how they pay for it. They actually have several positions.
Was there any talk of maybe joining us with the Greater Fremont Development Council, with any of these groups? That you're aware of? I've heard some, but I haven't heard any more since that was discussed earlier, maybe about a year ago.
That's a possibility.
Have you ever heard that? You don't know anything about it again?
Yeah, I mean,
That's
this,
always a possibility, though.
Well, that's, I just wondered,
Yeah.
and there, I think there had been some of the discussion, maybe Glenn knows about some of that, I'm not sure.
I think the problem is you gotta get somebody that's dedicated, they're, you know, they live, breathe, and die for the downtown.
yeah,
A lot of these organizations don't even have their people living in Fremont.
sure.
So that's the issue, is you've gotta get somebody that lives and breathes. That's all they do, downtown. Focus.
Yeah, and I would say, because of what's been done in the past, or more importantly, what hasn't been done in the past, it should be someone who's focused on downtown. I mean, they could maybe be looking at other corridors, but or commercial areas, but it needs to be someone with a real focus on downtown, because what works on Bell or what works on 23rd has no place in downtown. So I think that's just something to consider. We see Main Streets being the organizations that handle that. We see sometimes like a faction of a chamber working on that. I think we see when the city does it. So again, I think there's great examples. Maybe what we should do, maybe what we can do as part of this plan is just provide case studies of where communities have done certain things. I don't know if it would necessarily go in this plan, but maybe that's something we should come back and say, you know, in Lincoln, they do this. And, you know, in Carbondale, they do that kind of thing. But someone's got to pick this baton up and go, or you're going to be back here in 10 years. I don't think we want to do that.
That might be some of the problem. I mean, we need one captain instead of 6 sergeants.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And all the sergeants want to be
Yeah.
leaders.
Well, or they don't. I mean, part of the issue, I can't recall who said it, but she was spot on. I mean, she's like, we've done this before and we've talked about these things and we're just not implementing it. And she's like, I don't know who to talk to. I'm not even sure who should be doing this. So I think that's a real fair critique.
But just that it should be one.
It should be one. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like there's some validity to looking into a city position.
Yeah.
I know you look at the city of Kearney, I mean, they have one, similar sized cities have a downtown coordinator position. It's just, you know, a matter of, you know, I agree, the person needs to be invested into the downtown. It has to be able to coordinate with all the sergeants and get everybody focused on a vision. And I think if it is a city employee, I mean, they're there full time. I think that's what we struggled with, is cycle through a few people, you know, with Main Street and the employees that we've had. It's just a matter of funding for that position and job description and where they fit in. But we're getting to the point where, I mean, that's something that the city needs to look into.
Yeah, I would say at this point, based on having had this discussion now with quite a few of the organizations in the downtown or the periphery or other organizations just across Fremont, it needs to be, it really should be city-led. I would think that's probably your best example, at least as a starting point. People are looking to the city as the authority. I think it'll just feel like that person's in charge and they're the leader. And it doesn't mean they do everything. It just means that they're coordinating these different partners. So it really wouldn't change the nature of some of these organizations currently working in the downtown. It gives them a focus or someone to talk to directly. So, okay. All right. One of the last things, just some of the main elements that we pulled out when we talk about these different approaches for the regulatory strategies. So, I mean, we're not providing regulatory strategy inside this downtown sub-area plan, but we are moving that into the UDC discussions. So, you know, reevaluating what land uses are appropriate where in the downtown, the establishment or establishing those district-specific standards. You know, do we want to do overlay districts? Do we want to do new sub-districts? You could have a downtown zoning district or a series of sub-districts that could come out of this UDC discussion, so where we're going next. And then just updating the zoning map, review and update the sign ordinance. And then there's some, I'll call them like supporting documents, developers, how-to book. This is what our expectations are in Fremont, and this is how you should go about it. This is the process. These are the right people to be connected with. A pattern book or design guidelines. I think design guidelines can be very helpful. I would just based on our experience here in Fremont, I wouldn't go to the extreme end of design guidelines where you're getting into the mullions or getting into the window style, that type of stuff. But just giving some broad recommendations or how you might encourage certain types of development could be very helpful. So that way, when someone comes through with the proposal, are you consistent with our comprehensive plan in the downtown sub area? Have you reviewed our design guidelines, and is the proposal that you're bringing to us consistent with that? Those are the types of things city council can look at and say, you clearly haven't looked at this, or boy, this is spot on. It's exactly what we've been looking for. We want to keep moving forward in this process. All right, and then just next steps, where we've been. So we've been working on the introduction, the vision, and the land use development. So this is overall for the comprehensive plan. Today we're here presenting the downtown sub area, the draft sub area. Where we're going to be next time we meet in June, we're going to be going over really the entire comprehensive plan. So it's going to include the community facilities, natural areas, a portion of the transportation, which is going to be kind of a summary of the content that's being prepared in the long range transportation plan, and then implementation. So the next time we meet, we're not looking at pieces anymore. We're going to be looking at the comprehensive plan as a whole, which will be exciting. So we're getting closer to the finish line, but we still have a lot of opportunity for feedback. So if there's something you saw today or something you think about in the next couple of weeks, pass that to Jennifer, let us know, continue to make those refinements. So with that, I want to say thank you. I appreciate it. Is there any, I guess before I step away and Jackie comes up and goes through UDC, are there any other comments for the downtown that we want to talk about today?
Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I'll hand it over.
As I'm setting up the presentation, I think Jennifer's going to come by and drop off a copy of the draft version of Article 5. So just like the draft articles that were presented last week, these are in draft form. So we really do want your input, want your thoughts on all of the proposed changes that we're including. So the use-specific standards, Article 5 is what we're talking about today. So within our article structure, we're sort of right there in the middle before we get into the more broad general land use regulations. These build off of the standards that are included in Articles 2, 3, and 4, especially Article 3. So this is the use table included in Article 3. So all of these cells that are highlighted in green are uses that will have use-specific standards. So if you go back to that document, look at those cells at the table, you'll notice that they correspond to the uses that are discussed here in Article 5. So for the structure of Article 5, we've utilized these table headers. This is residential, institutional, and they're all throughout the table as the organization for this section. So you can easily navigate on a residential use. So I look in the residential section of Article 5 if I have any specific standards. So we are carrying forward many of the use-specific standards that you have in the UDC currently, but there are some general revisions that we're proposing be made. So starting off with the separation requirements. So almost all of the use standards that you have include a 300 to 500 foot separation requirement from residential uses, churches, schools, those types of things. So we're proposing to eliminate those separation requirements, depend more on the standards that we have for where different zoning districts are appropriate in the city, out within those districts. But we know that there are areas, let's say, that have industrial next to residential. That's something that exists currently. We're not going to propose that those light industrial areas be rezoned or those residences move out. So how do we deal with those conflicting land uses? And we're proposing to do that through enhanced standards for buffering and transition area rather than through just the space separation. So throughout this document, we reference different transition area requirements. So there'll be transition area A, B, C, and D. Those are standards that we are developing as a part of the next step in the process. So in the development standards article, so Article 6. So those will be brought to you the next time that we meet. So we'll go through those, but just for your reference, as you're reviewing this document, type A transition area would be the least intensive. That would be appropriate. And we have that here between uses of a similar type. And the type D is the most intensive. That would be your industrial next to your residential. So exactly what those landscape requirements would be is something that we would want to discuss with you at that next meeting. But just so you understand, that's the format for those transition areas as they're referenced. We are also proposing that your requirement for access for certain uses to be from a collector or arterial roadway be eliminated. And we know that this has been an issue in the past of getting certain uses within the community, especially since there's not a good map that defines what is a collector roadway, what is an arterial roadway. And so we want to eliminate some of those barriers and have those requirements for access be eliminated and control that type of thing through other standards. And last but not least, a sentence about compliance with federal, state, and local laws was added to almost every use standard. That's going to be true whether we say it or not. So we recommend just eliminating that sentence, getting rid of that redundancy.
Can I ask you a question? You
Yes.
said, requirements or definitions of collectors and roadways are difficult. I don't remember your exact words. There are federal and state standards. They're pretty definitive, and we had some debate about this during the course of the last year. So I don't see them necessarily as being an unknown. Say that we could totally eliminate them. I don't know if that's the appropriate thing to do, rather than the effective use of them. And one other thing that you said with regards to we're going more towards buffering or landscaping separation between residential and industrial, for example. I noticed on your land use maps, you're recommending that we do some insertions of industrial areas that may be surrounded by residential today. And so the protections that they might have been offered during standard R1, R2, R3, commercial, industrial, won't be there even with what you're proposing, because it would be a landscape buffer in the areas where you're going to infuse industrial in the areas that are across from the residential.
So I'll take your.
Make sure I'm understanding what I've seen on the land use map for recommended changes and the lack of what we're going to have for separation of them.
Certainly. Let me address your first question first. So for the collector and arterial roadways, I meant more so that the language in the code didn't clarify what type of map you're using. Is it the comp plan map? Is it the LRTP map? Is it the right? And that has caused issues in the past. I wasn't trying to say there is no way that we know what these roadways are. For the land use map, again, that's not the zoning map. And there is language that we're proposing be included for all of the zoning districts that would have some separation between your industrial uses and your residential uses. So the rezoning of that land area would be a consideration for the city to make at that point. But for some uses, if there is a separation, you want that greater setback, that greater distance, we can definitely discuss what those specific uses should be. And I think the same thing would be true for those collector arterial roadways. We just saw that there was an overuse of those standards across uses that really wouldn't have any type of negative impact on an adjoining residential that landscape buffering couldn't accomplish. So if we do want to say, light industrial, if it's next to residential, we need that 300-foot separation or that 300-foot setback. We can discuss that. Maybe that is something appropriate to be carried forward, but we didn't see it as appropriate for almost every single use that you guys had standards for. Are there specific uses that you think, is it mostly industrial uses next to residential uses?
I just used that one because I noticed on the maps that we're inserting some industrial areas where there weren't any before in the current proposed maps. And some of those are even more close to residential areas today. And I wonder what considerations might be taken into account for those people that have established homes there already.
Certainly.
And then when it comes to collector and material streets and the like, kind of varying on some of the businesses that you put in, but with good cause in some cases because of safety. Businesses that you put in there with children and other kinds of things, so it has.
Certainly. So I think with the setback, the separation requirements, that is something that maybe isn't use specific, but in the light industrial district, in the general industrial district, if your lot abuts a residential district or residential use, then your setback for your building for your use would be bigger than it would be otherwise. Rather than it being use specific, we could have it for the district more generally. That could be something we look into. All right. So I'm not going to review every single one of these use standards with you this evening. You're welcome. I just wanted to go over the ones where we are proposing major changes or they're completely new standards. So we do hope that you read through this document, provide us your feedback on the proposed changes, but just really wanted to highlight a few key ones. So starting off with your residential use specific standards, we're proposing new standards for duplexes. So for duplexes, they would be required to have their front entrances oriented towards primary streets. We would encourage them to have their garages either be detached or attached to the rear facade. But if they're going to be attached to the primary facade, we want to have some standards so that the only thing you see from the road isn't just a bunch of garages. So we discussed at the committee level before we met with you all about the issue that may come to pass if the standards that we have proposed in the document currently about restricting the width of the garage as compared to the width of the rest of the house would really restrict some of your current parcels that are entitled for duplex development from developing as duplexes. So we definitely don't want to restrict that. So it's some additional assessment will definitely go into what that exact proportion should be. But moving forward, we would recommend that there be some standards so that if there is a garage on the primary facade, that it's not taking up the entire front of the house. We do see the front door, maybe some front porch space, so there is a little bit more relationship to the street. It's not just garages everywhere. Now we're getting into row homes. So when we met last week, we discussed townhomes and row homes, and we were distinguishing between those two uses based on the number of units that would be attached. But based on the feedback that we got from the committee, there was one gentleman who's a developer who said that the building code definitions for these types of housing are very different than the zoning code definitions, and that causes a lot of confusion. So to try and get past that, to try and make this a little easier for everybody, Jennifer and I discussed eliminating townhome as a use and just covering it through row homes. Row homes isn't a term that's utilized in the building code, so we can reference the types of building code housing types that would fall under the row home. But the way that the building code defines it is more based on ownership, an owner occupied unit versus a renter occupied unit. And that's not something we want to get into in the zoning. So trying to avoid all of that confusion by just calling them row homes. So some of the standards that we're proposing for row homes, first, again, talking about how those are going to be oriented. So the units would need to be either oriented towards the primary street, like you see in this graphic here, or oriented towards an internal courtyard. And so you see that a lot. It would be similar to like these three here, if you just mirrored that on the other side, but there's no street. It's just like a yard space or a little courtyard area. So those could be oriented internally, but the end units would need to be oriented towards the street. So you would have some interface with the street for those end units. For corner units like we see here, they could choose whether they wanted to orient the front door towards the primary street or that secondary street. For the row home, we would have a maximum length of a cluster to be at 300 feet. That would be typically between 6 and 8 units. So this is showing a cluster of 6 units. But you could imagine 2 more added on, that would be sort of the maximum length. It would, of course, depend on the width of the units themselves. We also have a standard so that the placement of the townhomes is staggered to address things like the curve in the roadway, so we don't just have like plopped down townhome clusters or row home clusters. They're a little more thoughtful, a little more integrated into the site design. Moving into multifamily buildings. So this would apply to multifamily buildings, whether they are the smaller unit size or the larger unit sizes that are differentiated within the use table. And then they would not apply to multifamily complexes. So we'd have separate standards for those. But these standards are on, I believe, page 2 of the document in front of you. But those standards really are meant to, again, have those primary building entrances oriented towards the primary street, have parking located to the rear or the side of the building. So the parking lot isn't the first thing that you see. Would require some walkways connecting building entrances to the parking lot to the sidewalk, so people are able to move around that space a little more easily. Then when we get to the multifamily complex, because the internal circulation for those complexes isn't always such that you can have all of your primary entrances oriented towards primary streets. We have a list of priority orientation. So our priority would be to have those entrances oriented towards the primary street, but if that's not possible, maybe it's the secondary internal street or a common open space. The lowest priority would be oriented towards the parking lot, but we know that that is sometimes going to be a requirement based on the site. There's just no getting around it. So there would be the zoning administrator would be able to approve that orientation type. Any questions on the residential?
I would like to go back to the row home for a second in comparison. A lot of these other ones, you're obviously showing offsite parking lots, and when the buildings are situated, so those are not just visual. Go back to row homes then for a second. Those are all going to be front facing. And just prior to that, you talked about, and the garages are going to have to be a limited amount of frontal space. Those are going to be very narrow lots. Where are the design specs going to be used on the garages? Because we had quite a bit of debate about going to 28-foot streets and those kinds of developments having multiple cars per family and no place to park. There's no parking in the rear. There's no complex parking.
Right.
Parking in the street or parking on the ground, and that might only contain 1 or 2 stalls max. One probably, and that puts everybody in the street.
So that's a great question. So we do address parking in the row home standards. So what we say is that one of the parking spaces has to be provided in an attached or detached garage. And the attached or detached garage needs to be located on the rear side facades. Or it could be approved on the front facade by the zoning administrator, but the base allowance is for it to be on the side or the rear. So that could be accessed through an alley going through the rear, or similar to this format where you have like a common driveway that leads to a rear access for those garages.
Garage entrance could be a stall and it could be from the backside. So no front parking at all, other than for the ones you have in the back.
So the front parking, if you wanted to have like a driveway coming out here with the garage right in the front, we have that it could be approved through the process. So if it's a conditional use, it has to come in front of you all, then they could propose that. You could impose conditions, et cetera. If it's a limited use, then the zoning administrator would have well, you really could fit it this way. If there's restrictions, then we want to have that flexibility.
So in that drawing there, what Brad can talking about too, you have one common driveway to enter the rears of these buildings in, I guess would say.
Yes, it could be a common driveway. It could be an alleyway. A lot of townhome developments are including private alleyways. That would be similar to private access drives, but it would give you access to the rear, but still have and that really helps with the narrower units. You might not have enough space to have your driveway and your garage at the front.
It just seems like cost prohibitive impediment there. The cost of concrete and the need for affordable housing going up more now than it ever has. Concrete's expensive. And also, another thing for the multifamily, you're situating the doors and entrances away from the parking lot, which is it would make it more difficult on the tenant, the person that's renting you, that's the most important person in order, so everybody else driving by, it looks nicer.
So that's a great point with the multifamily. We wouldn't be saying you can't have an entrance off the parking lot. You just need to have an entrance on the primary street as well. So you typically see like a hallway that would go down the middle of the lobby space where you'd have both the rear entrance and the front entrance accessing that common space.
Yeah. For the townhouse standards don't make sense to me, especially the way that all the lots are designed now. That would be too great of a barrier, and for every time, I'm a developer, so every time now that I go in to get a townhouse, I have to jump through hoops in order to get it done the way that makes the most sense.
And so the concern there is the requirement for the parking, the garages?
Yeah, as of right now, based on demand, based on the way land use is, and based on the way the lots are situated and sized, we're sitting at 60 to 70% of the frontage being garage. if we do the setbacks, if we have the garage go around back, that's gonna be adding a lot to the cost as well as shrinking the size of the buildings that we're going to be using on there. So raising the cost per square foot. That would be put a big burden on us as well as the potential for resale.
Certainly, we definitely don't want to cause a more affordable housing issue. We know that's a big concern in the community. So a solution that some communities are coming to, we know we don't want to have garages be the first thing you see, the biggest thing you see in neighborhoods, but recognize the need that everyone wants a 2-car garage. We don't want to add the expense of having the longer driveway. What would you think about having the garage set back a little bit farther than the front of the house? So you have maybe a 5-foot setback for the garage, but the front entrance, that 30%, that 20% where you have the entrance would be pushed forward a little bit.
So one of the reasons we don't do that is for maximizing the lot versus impervious. So we have an impervious coverage ratio now that's 50% for townhouses. So what you're doing is you're adding more impervious coverage, but actually taking away occupiable square foot. So it's about the same argument.
Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on the townhomes? So this is definitely a balance that we want to strike well.
Jared, when you talk townhomes, you're talking a duplex, right?
Yes, sorry.
Right. So that's a duplex, whether it has a lot line down the middle or not. A townhome or a row house is
Right.
how we're defining these to try and avoid confusion, is 3 or more
Right.
attached.
I'm gonna add on to what Jared's talking about. I think he's talking about a townhouse, the way we build those today, basically, we're all under one roof. And so we basically have our garage married with the living quarters also there, similar to what we do with a single residential home.
So I think Jennifer was providing some good insight on the distinction that we're making between townhomes and duplexes. So I was hoping you could.
Right, and the way the lots have been platted for duplexes, whether it's one big lot for 1 unit or 2 lots with a lot line going down the middle, that's a unit. Those current lots would not allow for a driveway to go behind. They're not big enough, there's not enough space. Developers are building right up to the 5-foot side yard setback as it is now. Likewise, there's not room for a detached garage. So you would want to be looking at the primary facade. Now, I don't think I have maybe I do, because you were looking at differences in the impervious coverage and building coverage, and that might. So what they're looking at for building coverage in the R2 is 50%, 55% in the R3, and impervious of 60 to 65%.
On duplex?
In the overall, in the R2 and R3 residential districts, which would be the more medium-sized residential, more dense, a little more moderate, like Central Park or not Brooks Hollow, not Morningside Point has really big lots, so that would be more R1 type uses, but more than Central Park or Vermont Street areas would be more, would fit more into the R2, R3. Sunridge would be that type as well. So the papers that I gave you the other day, I'll take a look at those. So that's how the coverage. That might allow for some setback from the garage, and it's really a much more aesthetic look than to have a street wall of garages. If you can have some building articulation, it's more friendly, then of course we've got to do something that
makes sense,
affordable and works for
right.
our builders as well.
Right. And that is a discussion that we also had at the committee level. So we will be looking at adjustments to the requirements for garages that are on the primary facade for duplexes. All right. Any other questions on residential before we move on?
Luckily I got it.
So now I want to move into the lodging use specific standards. So last week we talked quite a bit about short-term rentals. So I wanted to present to you all some potential standards that the city could consider for short-term rentals. So these are on page 5. We don't have any numbers specified. We definitely want to get your feedback and determine whether all of these topics are things we want to address. And if so, what those exact parameters should be. So the first one that some communities will consider are the maximum number of guests per bedroom. So this ensures that you don't have sort of overcrowding of a house for an Airbnb use. You don't have 5 bunk beds stuffed into a single bedroom. A lot of communities will say 2 guests per bedroom, 3 guests per bedroom. Minimum and maximum duration of stay. In communities where there's big concern over short-term rentals being used as party houses, they have a minimum duration of stay of 3 to 7 days, so that it would, the college kids aren't going to spend money to rent a place for 7 days that they're only planning on using for a night. So that would help distract from that or detract from that. And then the maximum duration of stay would just help to distinguish a short-term rental from a typical rental. Other communities also have established a maximum number of days per calendar year that a residence can be used as a short-term rental. So say it's 30 days to 90 days is what we see most typically, but other communities don't have any type of restriction on that at all. And then last but not least, to address concerns of housing affordability and availability, some communities have installed a requirement for the house or the unit to be the primary residence of the property owner, so that you don't have people buying up second and third and fourth homes or businesses buying up homes to use them as short-term rentals. So we wanted to get your thoughts on these topics, and if you think these are appropriate things to regulate here in Fremont, and then if so, what you think those numbers should be. Any initial thoughts?
We had issues with this? I don't think so.
There are.
I don't think we have here, but we're being decent for 3 months. I mean, it's it's not a big issue here.
I have heard of issues of it, like she was saying that people renting a house at a house party.
Well, we just heard about the one that was in Philadelphia. That was this weekend.
Yeah.
200 people and 2 dead.
Yeah, well, and there are some communities, I don't think Fremont is likely to become one of these, but if there's a sudden construction boom, it could be an issue. But if you look at the tourist communities, Las Vegas, communities in Florida or along the coast, or places like that, there are people who are buying up vacation rentals, and the neighborhoods are kind of being eroded away because instead of having somebody living permanently in a house, it's a vacation rental. Now, I like that when I go visit a place. I'm not stuck in a hotel and my family can all share a house, but I'm also very aware that that creates issues potentially within a neighborhood. As we were looking earlier on, I think Airbnb, there's the Fremont Commons rents out a couple of their apartments as Airbnbs. There's 2 or 3 apartments over for the west center part of town. I saw one river property. So there's not a huge amount. It's something that can definitely be beneficial, but you want to have some, and the steering committee talked also about how maybe there's a difference between an apartment complex leasing out a couple of their units as short-term rentals versus houses and single-family houses and residential neighborhoods. So maybe there's different regulations for those two.
And in terms of demand for short-term rentals, there was discussion at the committee level too. Not a whole lot of demand for those right now, but there could be potentially in the future. There was discussion at the last meeting about an athletic complex that's coming in that could generate a lot of weekend travel that we would like to keep here in Fremont rather than see go to other parts of the region. So those were sort of the pushes to address short-term rentals at this stage before they're an issue, so that they don't become an issue over time.
I think there's been some discussion, at least I've heard some in the background, people that might be interested in some of this, and we don't have a vision for it. The items that you have up there for consideration need to be part of whatever we would implement, because if you implement something and you don't have any of that, it is open the door to problems.
Okay.
At the very least, limiting the number of properties one person or one entity can own for that purpose.
So maybe not require that it be their primary residence, but say you can only have 2 or 3 or however many in the city at one time.
Do we have limit property ownership on the number of short-term rentals? I mean, is there a way to say, you know, hey, you just meant you can only own 3 houses that are used for short-term rentals, and then how would we enforce that?
I imagine through the permit process.
Yeah, there's ways around it. You could limit the use of these. How do you police it?
But all they're gonna do is open up an LLC and they're gonna have an LLC with this many, an LLC with this many, an LLC with this many. So you're gonna, that's not gonna work.
Push back on that, because you have to make sure everything's up to code.
If you have standard for single residential family use, you have to enforce that. So it'd be similar.
I've had calls from Midland students. We don't do short-term rentals. Like somebody staying here for the summer and they want to pick up just a couple months. And we don't do it.
No, we don't either. But yeah, we have similar calls, so there's demand for it.
And Midland students, I hadn't even considered that they would for short term over the summer have demand.
And the railroad, I just got a call from the railroad on a similar issue.
Okay.
Or if they expand Costco or LPP, I've had inquiries from down there too.
Okay.
So.
Port authority.
Right. If we have a construction boom of sorts or some sort of housing or whatever, there's going to be places for people to stay.
So I think that maximum duration of stay should consider those Midland students in that summer period. So they could provide at least the 2 months or 3 months of housing that they're looking for. So I think that would be a good upper limit. But perhaps as you're reading these more carefully, you can give us your thoughts on what those other limits should be as well.
On the other hand of that too, I know of somebody who relocated out of state and took a teaching position. They rented like an Airbnb or VRBO because it was more affordable for them. So until they got to know the area.
Right. Right. I know plenty of people that have moved and they're not familiar with the city, not sure where they want to live. So use Airbnbs as a way of getting to know the community. Yeah.
And of course that was a big issue.
Sure.
Definitely pros and cons.
Definitely. All right. So I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts on this as you are able to read these standards a little more closely. All right, so the next one that we wanted to discuss was food trucks. We had discussed this previously as potentially being a use to consider to allow in the downtown and some of the other commercial areas. This is just a photo example of a food truck court in another community. They call it a food truck park. But the standards here do provide some flexibility, but then there are also some base requirements to ensure we have a safe food truck court. So the maximum number of food trucks that would be allowed on the site would be as approved by the city through a site plan review process. Obviously, the number of food trucks that can be accommodated is going to be dependent on the size of the site. So want to have that flexibility to not have an upper or lower limit that someone would need to meet if it doesn't make sense for that specific area. But then there would be some standards for food truck stalls. So where those food trucks would come and park, having access to electric, bathrooms, trash cans, recycling receptacles, separation between the food truck stalls, etc. Just some basic standards that we've used in several communities for this type of use. So next we move into our vehicle-related use-specific standards. So we are carrying forward many of the use-specific standards you have for your vehicle-related uses currently, but are proposing some more major changes to the vehicle fuel sales, which is currently covered under service station. So for the vehicle fuel sales, we're recommending a setback for canopies as well as fuel pumps from the property line and from side and rear lot lines so that you don't have some of the issues that you see today with too many cars stacking up trying to get to the different fuel pumps. So you have a little bit more room around the fuel pump canopy and access to those fuel pumps.
I want to point out something here. You know that what they're showing for design standard pushes the building up to the street front instead of having the building set back at the far end and then having the canopy back behind it.
That's not something we're proposing in Fremont. This is just an example graphic where that community wanted to have the convenience store be that first thing right up the street. We're not proposing that for here in Fremont. I apologize. I didn't get my example graphic tags on all of these slides. But yeah, definitely not something we're proposing here. We don't see that as being really feasible in this area. This was a graphic that was made for a community in the Raleigh-Durham area where that type of development is much more common. But so the setbacks from the property line and from the side and rear lot lines for the canopy would be 25 feet, except if it was adjacent to your residential districts. Then we're proposing that setback be up to 50 feet so that you have the additional separation from your residential uses, something that could be considered for other uses as well. And then another proposed requirement that we wanted to get your feedback on is for the first 4 feet of the canopy column. So right about this level, be clad in some kind of material. So it would be ideally something that would be similar to the materials used on the principal building, but something that would wrap those columns, make them look just a little more visually appealing than just the straight metal columns that you see today. So we wanted to get your thoughts on that, see if that's something that's appropriate in Fremont, or if it's something that we don't want to consider for this community.
I think it would allow great additional aesthetics. It needs to be salt proof.
Salt proof, okay. Hit proof, yeah.
But that's where a lot of your stations are gonna hang their window washing equipment and stuff like that as well. And then there'd have to be checks with NFPA to see if they have any regulations, because I know NFPA is gonna have a lot of regulations on what can and can't be in there with the fuel pumps.
Certainly, and there are many gas station examples that we can provide that have that type of cladding on the bottom half of the column. So we definitely know there are some building materials that they would approve of. It probably wouldn't be like wood or something very flammable, but there are cladding materials that would be acceptable.
For future build or any restoration build that goes on with those existing facilities?
That's a great question. So this would apply just like all of your nonconformity standards. If there's a completely new gas station that's being put in, they would have to follow these standards. If there's substantial rehabilitation to an existing gas station, they would need to comply with these standards. But we wouldn't recommend that the city go out and make them your existing gas stations, if they're not doing any other type of work, wrap their columns.
Put in new pumps, for example, is that being driven?
If they put in the new pumps, then the new pumps would need to meet the new standards. So if they are, extending their canopy, then that extended area would need to meet the standards, but the existing area would not. All right.
I personally can see a lot of problems with the cladding because them canopies shift and move and everything, especially with the wind and the snow and everything else. I personally think it would be an undue burden on the owner of the property. And then who's gonna first thing they're gonna do is, well, we gotta put them up because the city's gonna make us put them up. And then somebody's gonna hit one of them that's gonna fall apart. Nobody's gonna police it, and it's gonna look like sucks on a chicken after a few years. That's my opinion.
Any other thoughts? All right, so then for truck stops, they would need to follow all of the standards for vehicle fuel sales, but recognizing that obviously our truck stops are going to be serving much larger vehicles than our typical gas station. The height restriction that we have on canopies does not exist for our truck stops. The maximum height of those canopies would be approved through the zoning process.
Zoning process, I assume that those major truck areas they're going to be on the periphery of the community anyway, right?
Yes, I completely forgot that one. Absolutely not. So truck stops would only be allowed in the general commercial district and then only allowed adjacent to highway interchanges. All right, so the next one that we wanted to discuss with you all was artisan manufacturing. So this is a use that we discussed during our meeting last week, a new use that we're proposing that you all consider allowing in your downtown and some of your other commercial areas. So this type of use for our standards here would require a minimum of 10% of the area to have a retail component. And for that retail component to be in those storefront windows, especially important in the downtown where we want to have that vibrant storefront activity. Then encouraging that the artisan manufacturing area be visible from the retail area to help promote that experiential retail type of use. And then there is an allowance for a residential unit, a live-work unit within that use as well. So if we think about mixed use downtown as being vertical, where you have the commercial on the ground floor and the residential above, this is sort of horizontal mixed use where you're doing all of this within one tenant space or one floor of a building. All right, now we get into our accessory use specific standards. So you'll notice this is the longest list. Accessory uses always have lots of use specific standards, and as they are, they could have more impact on especially our residential areas. So we want to start off with accessory buildings and structures. So we are proposing that the city differentiate between accessory buildings and structures so we can regulate them differently. Accessory buildings would be things like a garage, a more permanent, larger building. The exact parameters for how we're going to define the two distinctly are still in question. So we definitely would like your feedback on that topic. But what has been thrown around before is if a building permit is required, if the building has a permanent foundation, it would be considered an accessory building. An accessory structure would not require a building permit. So the proposed standards for accessory buildings include a revised maximum size. So we've heard previously that the maximum allowance for an accessory building for a garage just isn't sufficient in some areas. Larger lots, larger homes, we might want to have a larger garage, and then maybe too excessive in other areas where we have smaller lots, smaller homes. That one base requirement doesn't really work in all circumstances. So the language that we have in here would have a maximum number of square footage, but then also restrict it to the size. So it'd be smaller than the principal building on the lot. So we have 75% of the size of the principal dwelling. And then we have sort of a placeholder for that maximum square footage for whichever one would be lesser. So we definitely like your feedback or thoughts on what that maximum size for the accessory building should be. We also discussed during the committee meeting that perhaps it's not the size of the principal dwelling that it should be based on, but maybe the size of the lot itself. So that if I have a really, really large lot with a small house, I could still have a larger accessory building.
That's how it is today. It's 7.5% of the size of the lot. It's the maximum size of your accessory building, but you still have to meet all of the building and impervious coverage requirements.
Still personally think that's a better standard myself, because in a lot of our areas of Fremont, especially older areas, the houses aren't necessarily large, the lots are. And if you're not careful, you'd be telling somebody they can't build a garage on the property you can.
That's true in
really
this area.
That really shouldn't be our goal. And I know it wasn't that many years ago, because I watched it. We shrunk the size of garages so small you couldn't park cars in.
Definitely don't want to do that.
Said enough is enough, because a 20 by 20 garage didn't do it.
No, not quite.
Well, the cars were longer than that, you couldn't park in it, but that's where the standards went. Never to see that example.
No, we're not going to do that. But I do think a maximum size that is proportional to the lot or the building makes sense. Maybe 7.5% isn't enough. Maybe it is district dependent. So we can definitely do some additional analysis and figure out what the right number should be.
And there are some very large lots in certain districts that have outrageously large outbuildings that are within that 7.5%. So I think that a maximum size and tying it to the dwelling somehow makes some sense, but in these older parts of town where there are smaller houses, there's certainly would be challenges with that too. So
how would you manage that if the entire downstairs was garage and the entire upstairs was living?
That's a great question. We're about to get into our accessory dwelling, detached and attached. But yes, that's a good point. How would you have different standards for if it's just a garage and it's 1 story versus it's a garage and accessory dwelling and it's 2 stories. We can discuss those, but I think the best approach will be basing the allowable size of an accessory building to be dependent on the district. So in our larger lot districts, it'd be based on the size of the lot and the principal dwelling. In our smaller lot districts, it's just based on the size of the lot, so that we aren't tying it to the small size of a house and not allowing an adequate garage size. All right, so moving into accessory dwellings. Currently, the code allows accessory dwellings, but does not distinguish between whether the accessory dwelling is detached, like we see in this purple option, attached, or internal to the home. So we wanted to have different standards for these different formats, recognizing that their impact on the neighborhood, on the lot itself, are going to be very different. So for our detached accessory dwelling units, we would only allow those to be on top of a detached garage or instead of a detached garage. You don't get a detached accessory dwelling unit and a detached garage. It's one or the other. And then the maximum size of the detached accessory dwelling unit, I would recommend be tied to the maximum size of the accessory building, so that we have the opportunity for the entire upstairs of a detached garage to be that dwelling space, or have that be instead of the detached garage. For the internal accessory dwelling unit, we're regulating that based on the percentage of the principal dwelling unit. So that we typically see this as a garage apartment, an attic apartment, not so much like the corner of your house like we're showing here. But we would restrict that so it's a percentage. It's not your entire thing, it's just a percentage. And then for the attached accessory dwelling unit, this would really look like an addition to your home. So we'd have some standards to ensure that it really is in keeping with the character of the existing home. The same thing for the detached accessory dwelling unit as well. And things like access, you wouldn't be able to have an additional driveway to access your accessory dwelling unit. You'd have to be served by that common driveway. Parking would have to be handled, all of that. So next we have Artisan Workshop. So this was a new use that we discussed, including in the accessory use list last week. So the big difference between an artisan workshop and a home-based business is whether or not you have offsite, our employees come on site from offsite. So at the artisan workshop level, you wouldn't be able to employ people to come in and work in your artisan workshop. It would just be you, maybe your family as well. You wouldn't be able to sell any goods from your workshop. You could, sell them at the farmer's market or whatever, but you couldn't bring people into your home to sell them. Restrictions on things like the number of deliveries would have to be in keeping with what is typical in a residential area. You can't have big semis, pulling up to your garage. And would have similar restrictions to what we see for home-based business. But for home-based business, as you allow currently, up to 2 employees would be able to come and work on site. Artisan workshops we're proposing be permitted by right, where the home-based business would require that limited use permit. So that's why we are distinguishing with the number of employees. So drive-throughs, you'll remember that last week we discussed including drive-throughs as an accessory use rather than, as the code currently does, restaurant, drive-through, recognizing that lots of uses have drive-throughs nowadays, banks and pharmacies and all sorts of different types of things. So we wanted to address drive-throughs as an accessory use, and in doing so, we've included a stacking space table, so a minimum required stacking space, and that's different based on the use. So for an ATM, your minimum stack would be 3 per machine, whereas a restaurant would be 6 per order box. So you'd have more stacking spaces required for your restaurant because more people are going to restaurants than they are lining up at the ATM. And then last but not least, for our, yes.
Can I stop for a minute here with the drive-through?
Please do.
So the restaurant here, as I'm reading this, does that limit you to 1 lane for order, or can you do a 2-lane, what McDonald's does today out here?
You could do a 2-lane. It would just be, you'd have 6 stacking spaces per lane, per order box. Yep. And we do have standards in here about 2 lanes versus 1 lane. So the width of your lane would be different if it's a 1 lane or a 2 lane, and then bypass lanes as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so last but not least, we have donation drop boxes. These pop up all over the place in parking lots typically. So the standards that we have here are pretty basic standards just to make sure we don't have donation drop boxes in our right at the intersection of the driveway and the street so that you can't see around it when you're trying to pull out or other types of issues that might come up. But one thing that we did want to get your thoughts on were whether the donation drop boxes should be associated with the primary use or whether they can just be sort of anywhere. So for example, this Goodwill drop box, should it only be allowed in the Goodwill parking lot or should it be allowed in the grocery store parking lot or any type of parking lot?
I don't like it anywhere, just by confining, they don't have to drag to their store to use it.
Okay.
That's my thought anyway.
Yeah, having scattered sites on a lot of these boxes, I think it's helpful for the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone used to have recycling places to like do that. So
Mhm.
that is category of just donation.
It would not, but we could definitely expand it to include that. When we had discussed that as well, maybe expanding this to like.
I think Tyler got a good idea, because when that was here, it was well used. The biggest problem has been the market today of the recyclable.
Yeah, but it was abused too.
Yeah, that's true too, yeah.
The mattress wouldn't fit in the box.
The bag was put to the, they just put it on top.
Yeah.
All right, so then our last topic that we wanted to discuss is one that we started to discuss last week, but wanted to get into a little bit more detail with you all tonight on the standards that could be applied to food trucks if the city wanted to move forward with allowing them or regulating them. So we had discussed two different ways that they could be allowed in the community, either at special events only or in parking lots or both. So the first one to go over is at special events only. So those standards, where they could be located, how long they could be there, all of that would be established through the temporary use permit process. So when they come into Jennifer and they say, I'm hosting this event, it's going to be 3 days long, I'm going to have 17 food trucks there. They can sit down, figure out exactly where they can be located and all the logistics that would go along with that. So that would be some lots of flexibility for those special events. But if there are food trucks that just wanted to be parked in parking lots on a more regular basis, we are proposing these standards to help regulate that. So first and foremost, located at least 500 feet from a brick and mortar restaurant. That was something that you all discussed last time as being an issue, a concern that we wanted to prioritize our brick and mortar restaurants and help them thrive versus our food trucks. Then for the site itself where the food truck could park, we would require full public improvement. So they can't just go out to an undeveloped piece of land and plop down their food truck. It would need to be a site with full improvements, located on a paved surface. Only one would be allowed per lot, and they would be required to have the written permission from the property owner. They could only occupy 4 parking spaces that are not ADA required spaces, or 650 square feet, whichever is less. They would be required to provide a trash can and a recycling can per truck. And then nothing could be kept on the site overnight. So they couldn't park overnight. They couldn't keep their tables and their chairs and their trash cans out there overnight. They'd have to pick up and move and go back to their home base. So I wanted to get your thoughts on these standards, whether they're appropriate, whether maybe they should be tweaked. The committee discussed the nothing on site overnight, perhaps having that be a set period that's established through the temporary use permit process. So they want to set up there for a week. That could be approved, but they'd have to pick up and go after that set defined time period.
You want to make sure that it's not required parking that they're taking out.
Okay.
And also the one per lot, what about a food truck area that's set up a parking lot that set up itself to accommodate food trucks?
So that would be more similar to the food truck court, that more like permanent thing. So that would be addressed previously. Yeah, so that would be addressed as a permanent use rather than a temporary use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how does those operate now? They're just there. There's no permit.
There is, well, they have a food, food permit.
Yeah, there's one right across the street.
Yeah.
Or food and beverage, they collect them, they're both collected.
Across from Tesco's.
No. They're collecting food and beverage from them.
My department doesn't, but they.
Yeah.
But do they actually get a permit from you?
So this would then require that?
Yes.
Yeah.
You may or may not be aware, but we've already broached this topic at the last council meeting, not in the zoning section or the UDC section of Fremont City Code, but rather in section 10.
Okay.
Are you aware of that?
I was not. And a lot of communities will address food trucks in another section of their municipal code, not address it in their zoning ordinance. And that's sort of a decision city by city. Typically, I would say if they are parked in the public right of way, we don't want to talk about that in the zoning code. In the zoning code, we talk about the private realm. So that's where we get into the parking lots. So that's where it could be appropriate in the zoning code, but could also be appropriate in another section of the municipal code. That's definitely a decision of the city.
Might be aware of it. That's already being discussed.
Okay.
So it's like food trucks, but we also give, for example, like flowers, art shots of the mall right now, and have those booths have flags and stuff like that. So how do you handle, would that fall into this category or is they?
So the setup for, so we have seasonal sales listed as a temporary use as well. So that would be what you would typically see in like your Christmas tree sales in the parking lot or the temporary flower shop that's set up, but they wouldn't be mobile like this. If we do see, and some communities are seeing mobile vendors pop up beyond food trucks. So we could expand this to not just be food trucks, but mobile vendors, if that's really the issue. If there's a flower truck going around, parking in the right of way, selling flowers, or, if that's the issue, we can definitely expand it. Oh yeah, we see that all the time in Chicago. Especially they'll just pull up and pop open the trunk and start selling stuff out of the car. So we could expand this to mobile vendors if there's a desire or a need to regulate that more broadly. But I think food trucks are really the most prominent thing, at least in Fremont. That
So John C. Fremont Days, we'd have to waive all this or what?
For John C. Fremont Days, that would be a special event. So that would be addressed separately.
So what about the?
Ice cream trucks are tricky, but yes, they would. Most often ice cream trucks, they won't park in a single location and have you come to them. They just sort of roam around. So they wouldn't really fall under that in parking lots distinction. But if they were going to set up shop somewhere, they would fall under this regulation.
What would we do with the food trucks that come in that are here permanently, like the bowling alley? He'll be coming back anytime and he'll be parked there all summer long. Then when the weather gets cold, he pulls it out.
Well, then that's the point. They would have to follow the regulations, whatever the regulations end up being.
Because there's no grandfathering in now.
Not for temporary uses, right?
I mean, is there some sort of a provision we could, I don't want to just kick somebody out of town, or either that or they're just gonna hot parking lots or, pull in and pull out. I mean, is there some sort of a permit that we could come up with that gives them a 3-month permit to park there as long as they've got written permission from the property owner to try to help them out a little bit? Which
it'd be pretty easy to get permission from himself then.
Yeah, but I'm looking at the one out at 30 Bowl. Like I said, it moves in and out. Where if the owner of 30 Bowl gives written permission and then you give him a 3 or 4 month permit, and maybe it's a higher permit than the person that's just in there for 12 hours.
You don't want to Staples do yet?
I think that's gone. But
like
there
the
is one,
idea-
it is one that comes in, and that fish truck comes in once a month or whatever.
I like the idea of the different levels of permits. So perhaps if you're only going to, you only want to be in that location for 1 day to 5 days, you get a permit from the zoning administrator. perhaps if you want to be there for a longer period of time, that's something that goes in front of the plan commission or the city council for approval. It's sort of a, because at some point you're not a temporary use if you're there for months on end. So maybe that's a different consideration, another level of permit that would need to be considered at that stage. All right. Well, that is all that we had for you all this evening. Do you have any other questions on our use specific standards? I know you just got them in front of you, so I doubt you've had the opportunity to read through and formulate any questions, but we do hope that you read these more carefully and provide us any of your written feedback. Please send all of that to Jennifer and she'll consolidate that and get it all back to us. Yes, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Okay, I need a motion to adjourn, city council. Okay, Jensen and then Gibson.
Gibson? Yes. Ellis?
Yep.
Deanna?
Yes.
Yerger?
Yes.
Jensen?
Yes.
Suburb?
Yes.
Motion carries 6-0, Mayor.
Okay, city council's adjourned, planning commission.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Michael?
Yes.
Workshop?
Aye.
Lathrop?
Aye.
Price? Gilson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
Yeah.